Welcome to Arlington National Cemetery's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Centennial Commemoration Lecture Series. My name is Allison Finkelstein, and I serve as Arlington's senior historian. For this episode, our featured expert is Dr. Kane West. Dr. West has spent nearly a decade working in national parks all around the United States. In his free time, he is a historian of the American West and the National Park Service. Working at Arlington House has been one of the most unique and rewarding posts during his time in federal service. In his episode, titled Arlington National Cemetery and the National Park Service, Stewards of America's Memory, Dr. West explores how the establishment of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier a century ago connects with the larger pilgrimage of commemorative sites that is found in the nation's capital.
Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in this lecture. My name is Kane West. I'm a park ranger with the National Park Service, and I moonlight as an academic. And so for many people familiar with more academic lectures, when we focus on interpretation and facts and stories, when we mix that in with the National Park Service, we add a little bit of meaning, of collective memory. And so the lectures end up sounding just a little bit different. And then to combine those two approaches within the enormity of talking about Arlington National Cemetery and the 100th anniversary, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, we'll sort of fly through facts and interpretation and meaning all in one. I want to talk about the National Park Service and several sites, including Arlington House, found inside Arlington National Cemetery, and several others located on the National Mall that are connected to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And I want to try to figure out how those different memorials that are protected by the National Park Service touch on much of the remembrance that we are finding here at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, to see this sort of citywide sites of memory and sites of remembrance. Just to give you a brief orientation, when we talk about the National Park Service, we see ourselves as the curators and stewards of many of the places that people come to in Washington, D.C. And even if you don't know that you are on the National Park Service property, if you've spent time at the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Marine Corps War Memorial, the Arlington Memorial Bridge, then you have passed through National Park Service sites into or on your way to Arlington Cemetery. And often we identify with the funny hats, and so it lets you know that we are supposed to be there even if we don't dress like normal visitors. But we are, as a National Park Service, more than our hats. The American people have tasked us with being the storytellers of the American experience. And in the National Park Service, we hold that responsibility, the obligations of memory. These are the stories that have been passed down to us by previous generations. When we are talking about memorials that were specifically created by previous generations, they could be roads or buildings, statues, schools, stadiums, and often they were built to remember sacrifice. And then the responsibility is for us today that we understand the message of those generations, to preserve those memorials, and that we share with present and future generations that responsibility of remembering. Part of our National Park Service mission statement is to protect and preserve the resources of today unimpaired for future generations. And so when we talk about war memorials specifically, those are generations that had suffered through war and told us, this is what is important to us. We now entrust you, the next generation, to keep that memory. And so it is an incredible responsibility in the National Park Service, and we thank you for entrusting us with the nation's commemorative landscape. And so as we talk today, I want to think about the messages that have been sent to us from previous generations, how they have asked us to remember, and how we carry on those memories today. So as we'll sort of do a flyby of several locations in the DC area that talk about memory, that give us this sense of generational remembrance. And on the steps of Arlington House, if you had been there in 1868, would have been gathered 4,000 people, men, women, children, holding flags and flowers. And that first decoration day in May of 1868 was in some sense the first time that the nation had paused to mourn together. Now, most of the crowd were Unionists. They had followed a procession that day up the steep hills of what is now Arlington National Cemetery, but was then the former plantation of Robert E. Lee's wife's family. The crowd was multiracial, perhaps members of the Gray family, who had once been enslaved by the Lees, had walked from their home behind the main Arlington house. And the gathering had been organized by Union veterans who did not want their comrades lost to be forgotten. And they would spend the afternoon talking about the cause of the Union and of the end of slavery. And they wanted to make sure that on that first federally sponsored decoration day, that the sacrifice of the Union soldiers would not be forgotten. From the steps of the Arlington House, the crowd proceeded to the rolling plateau that stretches behind the Mansion House. And they placed decorations at the more than 10,000 Union gravestones. Today, that area is called the Field of the Dead, and we continue that tradition in Arlington Cemetery every May on Memorial Day. Now, the main speaker that day was a man from Ohio named James Garfield, future president of the United States. And he spoke about the sacrifice, patriotism, and love of country. He spoke about the protection of the republic, the principles of democracy and its institutions. And he called the cemetery on those heights, quote, the sacred mountain of our capital, end quote. That would in effect wash clean the stain of rebellion and slavery. He also spoke about the soldiers who, quote, for love of country, they accepted death and made immortal their patriotism and their view, end quote. And he also spoke of those who had gathered at Arlington that day, mothers, brothers, sisters, fatherless sons and daughters, quote, from whose hearts the shadow of grief will never be lifted, quote. And he also talked about those not yet born who would return to Arlington in the centuries to come. Quote, hither our children's children shall come to pay their tribute of grateful homage, end quote. And I start with these details about Garfield's oration because he gave a blueprint, what I'll call for the rest of my talk, the equation of memory. And in this equation, I would like to identify about 4 parts. There's the physical memorial. There's whom should be remembered. And there's also who should do the remembering. And how they should do the remembering and what message should be remembered across time. So at Arlington, the physical memorial is the cemetery itself, the gravestones, the landscape, this temple of the country. And in the Field of the Dead, we would find who should be remembered, those soldiers who had died under the Union flag. And Garfield identifies who should do the remembering. Hither our children's children shall come to pay their tribute. And the crowd, the men, women, and children bringing flags and flowers were part of that annual tradition of how to practice the memory of what is now a yearly tradition of gratitude and of sorrow. And Garfield also told us a message of patriotism, love of country, of the Union, of the end of slavery. Now, I want to focus in some sense on our children's children who will come to pay tribute of grateful homage. He's talking about the future. He's entrusting those future generations with the stories to keep on telling. And so when we think about this commemorative site, it is a place where one generation tells future generations not only what to remember, but sometimes even why to remember. So if the Civil War is the first time the nation really mourns together, World War I is in some sense a second time. And when we're in this amphitheater on the site of Arlington National Cemetery, you can almost see a generation declaring that a memory should not be forgotten. The large amphitheater, part of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier complex, was finished in the years after World War I, and it has been the site of numerous profound speeches and orations and gatherings. And it was an upgrade from the wooden amphitheater that one can still see today behind the Arlington House. And while this memorial complex is probably the most obvious and famous of the World War I era, around the country, even today, you'll see statues. Sometimes they're doughboy statues. They're on a courthouse lawn or in a cemetery. Sometimes there are places around the country that are living memory spaces. There are stadiums, gymnasiums, bandstands, parks. You might be able to think of a park in your local community called the War Memorial or something to that effect. And these World War I memorials around the country that appear in the years after World War I were intimately local places where people were supposed to gather together. And in Washington, D.C., we'll take ourselves to our first site of national memorialization on the Mall. And the people of Washington, D.C. wanted to participate in that local memorialization process. Even though it was the nation's capital, and even though it was the Mall, the citizens of D.C. wanted to place a memorial there where they could gather together as a form of that intimate local memory. And they decided to build a gazebo, and opened on November 11th, 1931, on the 10th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That marble gazebo bandstand sits just off the main axis of the Mall. And if you look at the memorial, it was different from the memorials in the past. It wasn't a soldier on a horse, as many of the previous statues to war figures were. Instead, it was sort of a more neutral gathering place. And in this image, you can see World War I era soldiers gathered together, visitors and onlookers, musicians. And in the gazebo is inscribed the names of 499 DC residents who had passed in service during World War I. So even in the nation's capital, the local community wanted to have that personal connection for a living memory space. And it was a circular building just big enough for a jazz band. They wanted to have music. They wanted the memory of World War I sacrifice to involve the community gathering together to celebrate with music. Not quite what we would normally think. In fact, John Philip Sousa, the famous composer and conductor of the United States Marine Corps Band, who himself was a DC native, was at the unveiling and brought the inspiration of music. And in the early years, annual celebrations included the procession of poppies, when the daughters of World War I veterans would come in and lay flowers on the steps of the gazebo. And it has that local flavor. And so the first war memorial on the National Mall is intimately local. And so again, if we look at that equation of memory, a marble bandstand dedicated to the residents of DC who died in World War I service, who were remembered by their comrades, the living residents of DC. There were annual celebrations with a procession of poppies, and their sacrifice was to be remembered through song and community gathering. So once again, we see that equation of memory. Now, the memorial actually fell into disrepair in the last few decades, and it kind of reminds us that it's hard to keep a memory alive. It takes a concerted effort. Fortunately, the deterioration was eventually halted and then reversed by a man named Frank Buckles. He was the longest surviving World War I veteran, and he did not want to see the memory of his generation pass away. And he used the last years of his life to help renovate the memorial. And he succeeded. And the memorial is now restored. And today, groups can gather and marriages can take place underneath those inscribed names. And Frank Buckles can be found too. He is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery, about a quarter of a mile from the tomb of the unknown soldier. He passed in 2011 at roughly 110 years old. Now, when I mentioned DC War Memorials, perhaps y'all might have thought of a different monument, not the World War I monument. And so I want us to turn our gaze to the World War II Memorial, where the experience for visitors is completely different. It lies in the nexus of the National Mall, right in the center. And if you go at night, you see the reflections on the water. There's a large central plaza surrounded by the columns of 48 states, 7 territories, and the District of Columbia. It is a national memorial to a generation that was collected in common purpose and common struggle. And as one of the designers of the memorial said, quote, "It was a people's war and everyone was in it," end quote. And today, visitors not only see the pillars, but they see the 4,048 gold stars, each representing 100 soldiers who lost their lives in service to the war effort. So this memorial is highly abstract. It's on the national scale. Surrounding the plaza are friezes containing scenes of soldiers and riveters, nurses and farmers, an entire generation pursuing a common purpose. And so again, it's much more expansive, generation-wide. It's on the national level. And so it's interesting to see how visitors try to interact with this space. Now, if you visited there, what was the first thing you did? Many people will say that they went to their state's pillar, right? You went to find Ohio, you go to find Oregon, Maine, and Arkansas, so that you can find that personal connection within that national unity. Now, despite the grandeur, it's somewhat like the World War I Memorial. It's a huge social space because we are to honor those of that generation, veterans, riveters, nurses. And one of the special traditions that began taking place soon after it opened were the honor flights of veterans who've come to Washington, D.C., all together from all the states. And if you're lucky enough, as you see in the photo shown here, that maybe you'll get a chair, or if you're a park ranger, you like to stand nearby in your ill-fitting uniform. But this is a grand monument dedicated to a generation, sharing the message of triumph and determination, welcoming veterans to gather together and to be honored by the American people in the nation's capital. And then we shift again. You can almost feel the shift of a generation. From the World War II Memorial, you walk west to a much hidden, quiet, somber corner of the National Mall. The mood changes. The memory changes. The people who come here are different, and their purpose might even be different too than what you would see at World War I or World War II memorials. And as you look at the image on this slide, you might find some clues to where we have traveled. Shown here in the reflection is a person who is visiting a wall of names, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It is fundamentally different from the World War II Memorial. It was erected 7 years after the fall of Saigon by soldiers and veterans and organizations of Gold Star mothers. And when these memorial advocates spoke of their purpose, for them, they did not want their generation forgotten. They did not want the sacrifice forgotten. And they wanted a place of healing and quiet reflection. Unlike the bandstand or the Grand Plaza, visitors descend from street level into what has been described as a scar in the earth. The polished black marble panels stare back at you. The Vietnam Memorial, you won't see a narrative history of the war. There are no political statements. A statue of soldiers was added later as a compromise, but the only details about the war are years on the panels that cover the years of conflict. Instead, one will find the names of over 58,000 service members who fell during the conflict, etched into a polished black granite. It is the epitome of personal, a wall of names with no overbearing message, visited by whomever would happen upon the site. And immediately, once the memorial opened, a generation began to practice a form of remembrance that still persists today. It was not planned, but the people created one of the most profound shrines that we can think of in American history. Dog tags, teddy bears, thank you letters, apology letters, uniforms. The wall has become a place where people left the items that told the stories of the names etched into stone. We were not told as a country how we were supposed to think when we arrive at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Instead, we are invited to give our own meaning for each of us, whether you have a loved one on the wall, someone from your state, maybe you know a veteran, maybe we have simply taught that it is a sacred place where people gather at the wall in the brave act of remembering. For some soldiers, it's been described as a place of healing, for loss, for love. For Gold Star mothers, maybe it's a place of remembrance and mourning. And there are also people who come here born after the year 2000. And these generations with different connections and different memories are supposed to gather in this place and leave their stories. Now, even though every person is supposed to have their own sense of meaning at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I personally frequently come back to the statement of one Vietnam veteran. I'm going to borrow the words from a man named Captain James Mitchell, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Mike Company, who was on tour in Vietnam from November of 1967 to October 1968, and who led a company in the successful defense of Da Nang during the Tet Offensive. Like thousands of veterans, it took him decades to accept the invitation to join his comrades at their annual gatherings. He had actually written a book about his experience, though it was never published. He didn't say much to his wife, and he certainly did not share much with his children. Nonetheless, he did stay involved with his unit. Decades after the end of fighting, he had not stopped submitting paperwork for the recognition of his soldiers, including to make sure a Silver Star had been recognized. And about a decade ago, after his first bout with cancer, which the VA had determined was a result of his exposure to Agent Orange, he was finally willing to go to one of the small gatherings of former soldiers that no doubt occur yearly throughout the country. And he spoke for a few minutes to the soldiers who had lived through the same memories that he had spent decades trying to come to terms with. And his speech encapsulated how he thought about the war and included versions of scripture edited by men who saw combat too frequently. And I offer his words here because they reflect to some degree on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and especially now that we are 100 years from its consecration. And I apologize to members of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard, but the quote does focus on the Marines. And these are the words of Captain Mitchell. When a Marine is killed, his identity is withheld until the next of kin is notified. And thousands of mothers around the country think, is that my Marine? Thousands of coaches and teachers and brothers and sisters is that my Marine. And when one family receives the notice of the ultimate sacrifice, the rest of us have to think about it. And we realize it was my Marine, because the Marines belong to all of us. Now, Captain Mitchell, he didn't speak this in front of a large Memorial Day crowd, or at a political speech, or even at the Marine Corps War Memorial. I don't know whether he wrote these words on a letter left at the wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. All I know is that the man that I knew as my Uncle Jim offered that message to the men that he had fought alongside, and to the men who had saved his life. His are just one of the millions of tributes of memory left at the wall by cousins, uncles, siblings, nephews, to remember those left behind. And I carry those words from my Uncle Jim because he is describing that moment of recognition of sacrifice, even before we learn the identity of the ones who fell, of that soldier being our soldier, of the tragedy of loss and the yearning to find meaning. And whenever I go to visit the wall at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I say those words of Captain Mitchell. And I say those words whenever I am fortunate enough to witness the changing of the guard at the tomb. And when I had the honor of laying a flower at the tomb of the unknown soldier, I spoke those words again, that his identity is withheld, and thousands of mothers around the country think, is that my Marine? And thousands of coaches and teachers and brothers and sisters realize the Marines belong to all of us. And so when we think about the National Park Service, you, the people, have tasked us with preserving those places where we must remember. Whether it's playing music at the DC War Memorial, or gathering with honor flight veterans at the World War II Memorial, or leaving gifts between the names of soldiers at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And so when we turn to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, we see again that sacred equation of memory. To get here, state funerals pass by the Lincoln Memorial, cross over the Arlington Memorial Bridge, and pass between the statues of the Avenue of Heroes. They turn up the hill under the view of the Arlington House. And here in the tomb complex, we are told that when we read the inscription on the signature marble structure, that, quote, here lies buried an American soldier known but to God. We know who we are here to celebrate, including the two other soldiers from World War II in Korea. And when we are standing in this amphitheater, Charles Young, one of the first high-ranking African-American soldiers, his last funerary rites were in this amphitheater. John J. Pershing, who commanded the Doughboys in World War I, one of the highest-ranking officers in United States history, his last rites were in the amphitheater. In Arlington Cemetery, in the bivouac of the dead, these soldiers are guarded by the sentinels who perform one of the most sacred rituals in our country, the changing of the guard. And in that hallowed pilgrimage found in Washington, D.C., the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is unique because there lies someone interred. It is the place where we as a nation come to mourn and celebrate the hallowed dead. So we see who is to be honored and how these honored rituals are to take place. And so when you come to Arlington Cemetery, you're standing in that built space, the marble colossus of honor. And yet when we look for who is supposed to do the honoring, then that last part of the memory equation turns to us. We served as the generation gifted at the 100th anniversary with the call to remember. We have been tasked with the unfinished work of never forgetting. And so people came, they laid flowers because maybe they were a Gold Star family. Some of those who stood in line may have met a World War veteran. Some people were teachers of soldiers. Some of those who came had been screamed at in boot camp by someone with a US flag stitched onto their uniform. But each person came with their own connection, their own stories. Whether it was a comrade, a brother, a sister, a friend, whether that person came from far away or just because they felt the need to not forget. So when those people came to DC in that 100th anniversary, they had received the call. But again, to borrow from Captain Mitchell, the soldiers buried in the tomb are our soldiers because those buried here belong to all of us. That is quite a responsibility to be given, to be the next generation of caretakers. Those who come to the tomb are now those who James Garfield had spoken of in 1868. The children's children who have come to pay tribute. And so I want to thank you all on behalf of the National Park Service and Arlington National Cemetery that the nation continues to receive the call to never forget.